For generations, school books have repeated a simple, confident sentence. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. It sounds neat, clean, and historically certain, almost unquestionable. Children memorize it, monuments celebrate it, and nations have built holidays around it. But here's where the confusion begins. Columbus never set foot on the mainland United States. He never used the word America. He died believing he had reached Asia. And European maps show landmasses across the Atlantic before 1492. Yet somehow, the world still credits him with discovering a place where millions of people already lived. So what really happened? Why did this version of history survive? And who benefited from maintaining it? In this video, we are going to look beneath the familiar narrative, not to rewrite history emotionally or politically, but to examine facts, documents, archaeological evidence, colonial records, and forgotten voices. Because the truth about Columbus is not a single story. It is a combination of ambition, misunderstanding, myth-making, propaganda, and economic interests. And once we explore all of it, the phrase, Columbus discovered America, suddenly feels less like a historical statement and more like a carefully constructed marketing slogan. Columbus himself was not a simple heroic explorer. He was a skilled salesman, a man desperate for sponsorship, financial security, and social status. Born in Genoa, not Spain, he spent years trying to convince European monarchs that sailing west would lead to the riches of Asia. Portugal rejected him. England ignored him. Even the Spanish court nearly dismissed him until Queen Isabella finally approved, but only after years of negotiation. Historian Felipe Hernandez Armesto writes, Columbus succeeded not because his idea was unique, but because he refused to accept no for an answer. His stubbornness, not certainty, launched the voyage. But here's the twist. Columbus's math was wrong. He underestimated the Earth's size by about 25%, and had no idea that two vast continents stood between Europe and Asia. Even his contemporaries considered his calculations unrealistic. Yet accidents shape history. When Columbus reached the Bahamas in October 1492, he believed he had arrived near Japan. In his journal, he wrote, "I believe that we are near the mainland of Cathay." Nothing in his writing suggests he imagined a new world. So where did the famous phrase, "discovered America," come from? It certainly didn't come from Columbus. The term America came years later from another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, whose letters described journeys along the South American coastline. A German cartographer in 1507 labeled the continent America in Vespucci's honor. Columbus wasn't even mentioned. In fact, he died in 1506, still insisting he had reached Asia. Yet centuries later, countries began celebrating him as the founder of a new world. Why? The answer lies not in geography, but in politics. By the 18th and 19th centuries, newly formed nations, especially the United States, needed founding heroes. They wanted a clean origin story, something separate from British colonial rule. Columbus became a symbolic blank slate, Italian, Christian, European, ambitious, daring, someone who could represent discovery without being British. Historian William Fowler explains, Columbus was less remembered than reinvented. Monuments, textbooks, and patriotic celebrations did the rest. The myth became more powerful than the man. The deeper issue, however, is this: can someone discover a land already inhabited? Before Columbus arrived, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million indigenous people, thriving nations. Advanced agricultural systems, complex trade networks, cities larger than many in Europe. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, had tens of thousands of residents centuries before Columbus was born. The Inca road system stretched farther than the Roman empires. The Maya charted astronomical calendars with astonishing precision. Yet European narratives called the land empty or virgin. Why? Because it justified ownership. Language shapes power. Claiming discovery made colonization appear heroic, inevitable, even divinely ordained. Papal documents like the 1493 Inter se Terra instructed Christian rulers to seize lands not controlled by Europeans. The so-called doctrine of discovery became a legal foundation for centuries of expansion. A myth wasn't just a story, it was a tool. Supporters of the traditional narrative argue that Columbus connected two worlds, igniting the age of exploration, global trade, cultural exchange, and scientific progress. And yes, the Columbian exchange transformed the planet. Potatoes, tomatoes, maize, and chocolate moved to Europe. Horses, wheat, and cattle arrived in the Americas. Modern global economics began unfolding. But the other half of that exchange is often softened or ignored: disease, enslavement, resource extraction, and cultural destruction. Within decades of Columbus's arrival, indigenous populations collapsed due to smallpox, measles, warfare, and forced labor. In Hispaniola, where Columbus established his first colony, the indigenous Taino population may have fallen from up to 1 million to a few thousand. Columbus wrote in a 1495 letter, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all." These are not the words of a man discovering, but of a man claiming. Yet history is rarely black and white. Many historians warn against oversimplification. Columbus did not personally plan genocide. He did not single-handedly conquer a continent. He was a product of a Europe obsessed with spices, gold, territory, and religious expansion. The Spanish crown pushed him to extract wealth. Rivals pressured him to prove results. The system of empire existed long before he sailed. He merely accelerated it. But while academic debates continue, a bigger misunderstanding remains: that Europeans had no knowledge of the Americas before Columbus. That too is uncertain. Evidence suggests the Norse reached Newfoundland around the year 1000, 5 centuries earlier. Archaeological sites at Lanzo Meadows confirm Viking presence. Chinese treasure fleets under Zheng He may have explored the Indian Ocean and possibly beyond. West African kingdoms possessed maritime trade networks. Polynesians navigated thousands of miles across the Pacific. And there are old European maps, like the Piri Reis map, showing coastlines resembling the Americas before 1492. None of this definitively proves consistent contact, but it complicates the story. History rarely begins with a single moment, only textbooks do. So why does the Columbus story survive? Because simplicity spreads faster than complexity. A lone hero discovering a new world is easier to teach than centuries of migration, exploration, and indigenous civilization. Nations don't just teach history, they curate identity. Erasing Columbus would mean rethinking national myths, power structures, land claims, and historical accountability. Myths survive because they serve someone. Yet rejecting the myth doesn't require rejecting history. Columbus was undeniably important. His voyage changed the course of world history. Without him, global connections might have unfolded differently. The issue isn't whether Columbus mattered. The issue is whether we mistake consequence for discovery. But perhaps the most revealing part of this story is how the myth evolved long after Columbus's death. In the 19th century, when the United States was expanding westward under the slogan, "Manifest Destiny," Columbus became a powerful symbolic weapon. Politicians, writers, and educators framed his journey as the beginning of a divine mission, a justification for territorial expansion. The image of Columbus landing with a cross, claiming the land for Christianity, appeared in paintings, school books, and public celebrations. He was transformed into a national mascot for expansion, not because the historical record demanded it, but because the political moment benefited from it. This Columbus belonged less to history and more to national mythology. Evidence shows that by the late 1800s, Columbus Day celebrations were promoted heavily by groups seeking cultural influence. Italian-American organizations adopted Columbus as a cultural hero due to his Italian origins, helping establish a sense of belonging in a society that discriminated against them. Congress officially recognized Columbus Day in 1934, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt made it a federal holiday in 1941, largely due to lobbying by the Catholic organization Knights of Columbus. The holiday emerged not from ancient tradition but from 20th century politics. Meanwhile, indigenous perspectives were largely ignored, erased, or dismissed. For centuries, indigenous oral histories, treaties, land claims, and cultural records were overshadowed by the idea that the continent needed to be discovered, as if it began the moment Europeans saw it. A Navajo historian once remarked, "We did not discover America. America discovered us." That simple sentence challenges an entire worldview. So what if we reframe the question? Instead of asking, "Did Columbus discover America?" ask, "Who benefits from saying he did?" When we follow that thread, the myth becomes less about Columbus and more about power, the power to define history, and through it, identity. For European empires, Columbus symbolized destiny. For new nations, he symbolized legitimacy. For immigrants, he symbolized inclusion. But for indigenous communities, he symbolized a beginning, not of discovery, but of catastrophe. And yet historical memory is shifting. In recent decades, textbooks have begun acknowledging indigenous civilizations, pre-Columbian trade routes, and the devastation of colonization. Universities teach the complexities of the Columbian exchange, both beneficial and destructive. Some cities replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Statues have been removed, debated, or reinterpreted. These actions aren't about erasing history. They are about expanding it. Still, some argue that judging Columbus by modern standards is unfair. They say he lived in a world where conquest, slavery, and territorial claims were normalized. Historian Patricia Seed states, "Columbus was not unusually ruthless for his time, he was typical." In that sense, Columbus was not uniquely monstrous, nor uniquely heroic, simply a man shaped by the ambitions, beliefs, and economic pressures of 5th–10th century Europe. Understanding him requires understanding that time. But others counter that even by the standards of his era, Columbus faced criticism. Spanish officials removed him as governor of Hispaniola due to reports of brutality, mismanagement, and corruption. In a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella, Spanish investigator Francisco de Bobadilla wrote, "There were terrible cruelties. Men were hanged, burned, or cut to pieces." Columbus was arrested and briefly returned to Spain in chains. That part rarely appears in school posters. So the issue is not discovering a villain, it is recognizing that history is layered, debated, and evolving. Columbus is neither the flawless hero of patriotic mythology nor the singular architect of colonial violence. He is a symbol, a mirror reflecting what societies choose to see. And that choice changes over time. Today, historians ask different questions. What did indigenous societies look like before European arrival? How did disease shape conquest? To what extent did global capitalism, not divine destiny, drive exploration? These questions remind us that history is a conversation, not a final verdict. Archaeological research across the Americas continues to uncover complex civilizations, large-scale agriculture in the Amazon, ancient road systems in Peru, monumental architecture in Central America, and advanced governance structures among North American nations. These discoveries reveal that the story of the Americas did not begin in 1492. It was interrupted. Even genetic studies confirm deep, ancient human presence across the Americas. Indigenous communities were not passive observers of history, they were history. They shaped land, culture, technology, trade, and identity long before Columbus was born. The phrase "discovered America" unintentionally erases all of that. And perhaps that is why this conversation matters, not to blame, but to acknowledge. The truth is that Columbus changed the world, but not in the way simplified narratives suggest. He didn't open a new world, he connected old ones. He didn't discover America, he initiated a collision of civilizations. His voyage marks the beginning of globalization, empire, environmental exchange, technological transfer, cultural transformation, and tragic human loss. To pretend it was simply discovery is to ignore the consequences, so what should we say instead? Maybe this. In 1492, Columbus arrived in the Americas, beginning centuries of cultural and geopolitical change. It's not poetic. It won't fit neatly into a school poster. But it is honest, and honesty is a more powerful tribute to history than myth. Still, myths survive for a reason. They simplify identity. They comfort uncertainty. They offer heroes when reality offers complexity. But complexity doesn't weaken history, it strengthens it. When we question historical narratives, we don't destroy them. We deepen them. We make space for more voices, more truths, more humanity. So did Columbus discover America? The answer depends on what we mean by discover. If we mean he found a previously unknown continent, no. If we mean he initiated permanent European presence, yes. If we mean he connected worlds that had been separated for millennia, absolutely. If we mean he was the first outsider to arrive, probably not. And if we mean his arrival benefited everyone, clearly not. The story of Columbus is not a single sentence, it is a debate. A debate about who writes history, who owns history, and who gets remembered in it. It reminds us that history is not just about the past, it shapes the present. Because myths aren't harmless. They influence policy, education, national pride, cultural identity, and land rights. If we accept a simplified story, we risk misunderstanding the world we live in today. But if we ask difficult questions, like the one at the heart of this video, we honor the complexity of human history. So next time someone repeats the old phrase, Columbus discovered America, maybe pause and ask, who decided that was the story? And who was left out of it? History becomes clearer, not darker, when we turn on the light.